The wind that day carried more than dust. It carried silence, an unnatural silence that pressed on the skin like a fever, that slid into the bones until even the heart seemed to beat slower. The plains stretched out forever, golden in some places, burned black in others, scarred by hooves that had passed weeks before, and wagon wheels that had cut shallow graves into the earth. There should have been life here, buzzing insects, grazing cattle, a hawk circling for prey. But there was nothing, only a lone rider, Eli Mercer. A cowboy by trade, but that word, cowboy, had stopped meaning much to him years ago. He wasn't chasing herds anymore, wasn't singing around campfires, wasn't breaking broncs for pay. He was just a man moving through a country that had forgotten his name, carrying scars that nobody asked about. The land was empty, but Eli had learned, long ago, emptiness was never really empty. Somewhere, hidden just beneath the silence, there was always something waiting. Sometimes it was a rattler in the brush. Sometimes it was a man with a rifle who didn't want company. Sometimes it was worse. That morning, Eli hadn't expected to find anything, not even himself. He had been following a trail that wasn't really there, his eyes tracing faint marks in the dirt, the ghost of wagon wheels, the suggestion of prints washed nearly away by time and wind. But the trail didn't matter. He wasn't even sure why he followed it. Maybe because men like him needed the shape of something ahead, even if it was only emptiness. Then he saw her. At first he thought it was a trick of the light. Heat shimmer, rising from the earth, blurring shapes into illusions. He blinked, adjusted his hat against the sun. But the shape didn't vanish. It grew clearer, sharper, the closer he came. It was a figure, crouched in the dust, folded into itself like a broken thing. Eli slowed his horse, boots pressing into the stirrups as his eyes narrowed. The figure was small, too small to be a grown woman, too fragile to be a boy. The horse blew out a nervous breath. Eli tightened the reins, scanning the horizon. Empty, no riders, no wagons, no sound, just this figure, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. He rode closer, and that was when the details emerged. The figure was a girl, young, though not so young as to be a child. Barefoot, her feet cracked and bleeding from stone and thorn. A dress torn almost to rags hung from her shoulders, clinging to a body that looked more like bone than flesh. Her hair, black as midnight when it wasn't caked with dirt, fell across her face in wild strands. And then, as the shadow of Eli's horse fell over her, she lifted her head. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in years, Eli Mercer felt something stir in his chest. A sensation that was not pity, not compassion, but something sharper, something like recognition. Because those weren't the eyes of someone alive. They were too empty, too hollow, and yet, in their hollowness, they carried weight. Stories too dark to be spoken. Memories too sharp to be forgotten. For a moment, Eli forgot to breathe. The world around him faded. The silence deepened until it was only those eyes and the man who had stumbled upon them. The girl's lips parted, trembled, but no sound came. Eli dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the dry soil. He approached like a man walking toward a wounded animal that might either collapse or strike. "Where's your family?" he asked, his voice low, raspy from days without use. The girl only stared. Her throat moved, but still no words. Eli tried again, softer this time. "Your name?" Her lips moved, soundless, like she was chasing the memory of a word but couldn't catch it. And then she dropped her gaze, clutching tighter at the cloth pressed to her chest. A scrap of fabric, worn and faded. It looked torn from something larger. A shirt, maybe. A dress. The way she held it was not casual. It was desperate, like a relic of something sacred. Eli crouched down on one knee, studying her up close. She smelled of dust and sweat and old blood. Her arms were marked with bruises, some fading yellow, others fresh and dark. A storm of questions churned in his head, but he asked none of them. He knew the answers wouldn't come. "You can't stay out here," he muttered, glancing across the horizon. The land gave him nothing back. No tracks of those who might have left her. No buzzards in the sky. No smoke of camps. Just silence. A silence so complete, it made him wonder if he'd stepped out of time itself. He reached a hand out slowly, carefully. His calloused fingers brushed her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away. "That's it," he whispered. "Ain't no harm coming from me." He stood, offering his hand again, palm open. For a long time she didn't move. Her wide, dark eyes stayed locked on his, filled with something he couldn't name. Not trust, not fear. Something between the two, like a drowning soul watching a rope being lowered but unsure if it was real. Finally, slowly, her hand rose. Small, dirt-streaked fingers slipped into his rough grip. And in that instant, Eli knew something he didn't want to admit. His life was no longer his own. He had just taken hold of a burden that would change his trail forever. He lifted her gently onto his horse. She was lighter than she should have been. So light, he could feel the bones of her shoulders. Through the fabric, she leaned against him, her head pressing to his chest. And in that contact, Eli heard her breath. Shallow, trembling, like a creature that had run too far and had nothing left. He settled in the saddle, holding both reins and girl, his eyes scanning. The horizon again. The land looked the same as before. Endless. Empty. But Eli Mercer felt it in his gut. The silence wasn't natural. This girl wasn't just lost. No. This girl was left, and someone, somewhere, was waiting for the silence to finish what they had started. Eli tightened his jaw, nudged his horse forward, and let the wind swallow the trail behind him. For the first time in years, the wanderer wasn't alone. But he had no idea what kind of shadow he had just invited into his saddle. The land stretched on without end, and with every mile Eli Mercer carried her, the silence between them grew heavier. He had expected her to break at some point, to cry, to ask for water, to whisper a name, but she remained as silent as stone. The girl clung to him only by necessity, her small hands gripping the fabric of his coat, her body so light that Eli sometimes glanced down just to make sure she was still there. Her breath pressed against his chest, warm and fragile. It reminded him of holding a bird with a broken wing, alive, but only barely. The trail he chose wasn't really a trail at all. He avoided the wagon ruts, avoided the known paths where riders might appear. Something in his gut told him that whoever had left her in that wasteland wasn't far. Maybe they had turned back already, curious to see if she still crawled. Maybe they were watching even now, hidden in the folds of land. Eli didn't trust the quiet. The horizon never changed. Brown earth, yellow grass, distant hills like teeth. But every shadow made him glance twice, and every gust of wind carried the ghost of pursuit. After hours, he finally pulled the horse toward a dry creek bed. The sun was dropping low, bleeding across the sky, and his body ached from holding her upright. He swung down, lifting her carefully from the saddle. Her feet brushed the dirt and she stumbled instantly, legs too weak to hold her. Eli caught her before she fell, easing her against the side of a cottonwood tree that had somehow survived the drought. Up close again, he saw the toll of the ride. Her lips were cracked, her eyes unfocused, her breath shallow. He crouched, unfastening his canteen and pressed it to her mouth. "Drink." For a moment she didn't react, as if she didn't understand. But then she sipped, just enough to wet her tongue, to prove she was still tethered to life. Eli studied her in the dying light. Dust clung to every inch of her. Scratches lined her arms and legs. Her hair, when it shifted in the wind, revealed patches of scalp too, thin, as if hunger had stolen even from her crown. But what unsettled him most were her eyes. When she looked at him, it wasn't with gratitude. It wasn't even fear. It was as though she were measuring him, weighing his worth silently. "Girl," he said quietly, "you got a name?" Her lips moved again. A sound escaped this time, rough, faint, like air moving through rusted metal. But the word never formed. Eli leaned closer. "Say it again." She shook her head, clutching the scrap of cloth tighter to her chest. Whatever was written on that fabric, whatever it had once belonged to, it was all she had left. He wanted to press her, to demand an answer. But he didn't. Not yet. Something in her silence told him the name, when it came, would carry more weight than he was ready to bear. Instead, he built a small fire from what little driftwood lay in the creek bed. The flames flickered weak and low, casting long shadows that crawled across the girl's face. She sat curled into herself, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the ground, as if afraid to look beyond it. Eli chewed a strip of jerky, but he didn't offer her any yet. He had seen the hollow look in her stomach. If she ate too fast, it would do more harm than good. She needed water first, then patience. Survival had rules Eli knew too well. As darkness settled, the sounds of the night crept in, distant coyotes, the whisper of wind through the grass. But Eli's mind was elsewhere. He kept turning over questions. Who had left her? Why had she been spared when everything about her screamed she wasn't meant to survive? And why, of all men wandering the West, had she fallen into his path? The fire cracked softly. The girl flinched at the sound. Eli studied her again, his jaw tight. He hadn't asked for this. He had promised himself he would never again carry another's weight. The world was cruel enough without dragging someone else into your shadow. But there she was, and he knew, deep down, though he didn't want to admit it, that if he let her go, if he left her in this creek bed to die, he would carry her ghost longer than any man could endure. "All right," he muttered finally, his voice half a growl, half a surrender. "You stay close. You don't speak. Fine. But you stay close." Her eyes flicked to him for the briefest second, the fire reflecting in them like distant lanterns. And in that flicker, Eli Mercer saw something he had not seen in years. Not hope, not life. Something darker. Something that warned him this girl was not just a burden, she was a storm. And whether he liked it or not, she was riding with him straight into the heart of it. The morning came gray and heavy. Clouds had gathered during the night, smothering the sky, and the land smelled faintly of rain that never seemed to fall. Eli rose early, stoking the last embers of the fire into a reluctant glow. The girl was awake already. She hadn't slept much. He could tell by the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her eyes lingered on the horizon, as if expecting it to open and swallow her whole. She still hadn't spoken, not a word, not even a sound beyond the ragged breathing of someone whose dreams had teeth. Eli poured a little water into a tin cup and held it out. She accepted it with trembling hands. Her fingers were raw, the nails broken, her palms etched, with cuts that looked older than the journey she had taken with him. She drank slow, cautious, as if every swallow was being counted by someone she couldn't see. Eli watched her closely. He wanted answers. Where she had come from, who had done this to her, why she clung to that rag of cloth as if it were the last nail in the coffin of her memory. But he knew better than to force words from someone whose silence was armor. He packed their meager camp, saddled the horse, and lifted her gently up again. She weighed nothing. It was like lifting a shadow. They rode. The land changed. The open plains gave way to broken ridges, to the black skeletons of trees burned in some fire seasons ago. The air here felt different, colder, sharper. Eli didn't like it. He had traveled enough to know when land carried memory, and this place carried too much. By noon, he noticed her. Noticed the way her body stiffened whenever the wind carried a distant sound. Once, it was the call of a crow. Another time, the low groan of the earth as the horse's hooves broke through dry crust. Each time her grip on his coat tightened, her breath quickened. Something, or someone, was lodged in her memory, and every sound threatened to wake it. "Easy," Eli muttered, steadying her small hands with his own. "Ain't nothing out here but ghosts. And I don't reckon they mean to bother us." But she didn't relax. That night, when they camped again in the shadow of a ridge, Eli handed her a strip of bread. She hesitated, then tore into it with the hunger of someone who hadn't seen food in days. He had to pull it back before she hurt herself. "Slow," he warned. "You'll choke." She froze, bread still clutched tight, and her eyes lifted to his, wide, startled, almost guilty. And in that gaze, Eli understood something. She wasn't afraid of starving. She was afraid of being punished for eating. His stomach tightened. "Who did this to you?" he whispered. But she lowered her head again, clutching the cloth to her chest like a shield. The firelight flickered against her face, casting shadows across her eyes. She seemed carved out of silence, every line of her body holding secrets too heavy for words. Eli leaned back against a rock, chewing slowly on his own ration. He wanted to tell himself he didn't care, that she wasn't his responsibility. But each hour with her chipped away at that lie. He remembered another girl long ago. His own sister. She had been 12 when fever took her, leaving Eli alone in a house that had lost its laughter. He had carried that loss with him across every mile since, burying it beneath whiskey, beneath gun smoke, beneath the dust of towns he never stayed in. And now here she was, not his sister, not anyone he knew, but her silence, her fragility. It pulled that old wound wide open. He didn't sleep that night. Every crack of wood in the fire, every whisper of wind made him check the horizon. The land felt watched. The girl's silence felt watched. And Eli Mercer, for all his hardness, felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing down on them both. Just before dawn, as the fire burned low, he caught her staring at him. Not with fear, not with gratitude, but with something deeper, something like warning. The second day on the trail dawned clear, though there was no peace in that clarity. The clouds had broken during the night, leaving a pale sky stretched wide above them. But to Eli Mercer it felt more like an eye than a ceiling. The emptiness of the land was complete. No trees, no streams, no smoke in the distance to mark the presence of other men. Just dust, sun, and horizon. To most, it would look like safety. To Eli, it was the opposite. Wide land gave no cover, and no cover meant anyone could see you long before you saw them. The girl sat in front of him on the horse, silent as ever, her small body rigid, her hands locked around that strip of cloth she carried. She had not let it go once, not even when her fingers cramped around it during the night. Eli didn't ask. He had learned that her silence wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, a silence that contained more than any words could carry. It wasn't the silence of a child who didn't know how to speak. It was the silence of someone who had seen too much and had learned that words only invited pain. By midday, when the sun had climbed high and heat shimmered across the earth, Eli spotted something. At first it was only a faint scuff in the dirt, so faint he almost ignored it. But experience had taught him to look twice at the land. He pulled the reins, brought the horse down to a slow walk, and leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes scanning. There it was again, not just a scuff, the mark of a boot heel. Eli's stomach tightened. He slid from the saddle, landing with a dull thud, and crouched low to the ground. The prints were faint, but they were there. Boot heels, wagon wheels, and the deeper indentations of horse hooves. He traced them with his fingers, the way a man might read words on a page. The trail was not old. 2 days, maybe 3 at most. And there were too many. This wasn't a single rider passing through. There had been a dozen at least, maybe more. Wagons, supplies, men traveling together with purpose. He straightened slowly, his jaw tightening as he looked back at the girl. She had slid down from the saddle, her bare feet sinking into the dust, her small frame trembling in the hot wind. Her eyes found the trail, and in that instant, Eli saw something change in her. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't even fear. It was recognition. She knew this trail. Her eyes darted away quickly, as if even looking at it for too long might draw something out of the earth. She pressed the cloth tighter to her chest and turned her back on the prince, shoulders rising, body curling in on itself like a creature bracing against a blow. Eli's voice came out low and steady, though it carried an edge sharper than he intended. Was it them? The girl didn't answer. She didn't have to. He had spent his life reading the things men didn't say, the gestures they didn't know they made, the tremors that lived in silence. The way she refused to face the trail, the way her breathing had quickened, he had his answer. He spat into the dust, a bitter taste rising in his throat. Whoever had left her behind had done it with intent. This was no accident. No lost child, wandering from a wagon camp. Someone had abandoned her out here with the expectation that the land would finish the job. But she hadn't died. She had lived long enough for him to find her, long enough to still be standing here now. And that survival, Eli knew, would not sit well with the kind of men who made decisions like that. He felt eyes on his back even though the ridge behind him was empty. That night, he made camp in the shelter of a shallow ravine, a place where walls rose on either side to keep out the wind. Normally he would have lit a fire without hesitation. There was comfort in flame, in warmth, in the way it held back the dark. But tonight he struck no spark. The girl was too restless, her gaze, flicking toward every shadow, every corner of the ravine as though something might step out at any moment. He could feel it too. They were being followed. Maybe not by men yet, maybe only by memory, but something had found its way into their trail and was walking it step by step. The stars burned sharp and white above them, spilling cold light over the ravine. Eli lay with his back to the rock, one hand resting on the grip of his revolver, the other holding the brim of his hat low over his eyes. The girl curled not far from him, her knees tucked to her chest, the cloth clutched against her mouth as if it alone could keep her breathing. Steady, at some point during the night, Eli stirred. A sound had woken him, not the cry of a coyote, not the shifting of his horse. This was different. It was a voice. He sat up, still as stone, his ears straining. The sound was soft, almost swallowed by the wind. But it was there. A whisper. Fragile, uneven, the sound of someone who hadn't used their voice in too long. The girl. She was awake, sitting upright, whispering into the rag she carried. Her lips moved against the cloth, her breath catching on each word. At first Eli thought it was nonsense, broken fragments of language worn thin by silence. But then, leaning closer, He realized it wasn't nonsense at all. It was a name. Over and over, she breathed it into the cloth as though it were a prayer, as though speaking it aloud to anyone else would break the world apart. Eli froze. He didn't recognize the name. It wasn't hers. The repetition was deliberate, desperate. Whoever the name belonged to, it was her anchor. Her last tether to something beyond this nightmare. Eli watched her until the whispering slowed, until her small body sagged again into exhaustion. He leaned back against the rock, his face tight, the name echoing in his head though he didn't know its meaning. That night, as the cold gnawed at him and sleep refused to come, Eli Mercer understood a truth he hadn't wanted to face. He hadn't just found a girl in the dust. He hadn't just lifted her from death's doorstep and carried her across the plains. He had picked up a shadow, not hers, someone else's, and shadows like that do not vanish. They follow, step for step, until the day they decide to show themselves. The saloon smelled of smoke and sweat when Samuel pushed the door open. His boots echoed on the warped floorboards as men turned their heads to look at him, then at the girl who followed 2 steps behind. The piano stopped. Cards were dropped. Drinks hung in the air, halfway to the lips of men who no longer had the courage to swallow. The place fell silent in the way only guilty men could command silence, because every one of them carried a piece of the truth he was about to uncover. He spoke not with a shout, but with the calm of someone who knew time was now on his side. "She remembers," Samuel said, voice steady, eyes cutting through the crowd. "Not everything, but enough." The girl stepped forward. Her small frame seemed almost swallowed by the lantern light, but her voice carried like broken glass. "You took me. You burned my family's home. You made me forget my name." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the cowhands shifted nervously. Others tried to drink away the words. But one man, seated at the back with a whiskey untouched before him, leaned forward. His coat was fine, far too fine for the desert. His mustache was trimmed, his boots polished. A man who believed the world was his to buy and sell. His name was Clayton Reeves, a ranch baron who had bribed judges, bought sheriffs, and buried more lives than the desert could count. He rose slowly, clapping his hands once as though amused. "So the ghost speaks," he said. I wondered when the little bird would remember the fire. His eyes narrowed. I thought the flames had eaten everything. Apparently not. Samuel's hand hovered near his holster, but he did not draw. He knew Clayton was baiting him, trying to make him the villain in the eyes of the law. So Samuel only asked, "Why her? She was just a child." Clayton laughed, a sound slick with arrogance. "Because her father thought he could own land I wanted. Because he stood in the way of progress. Because in this country, survival belongs to the man willing to burn what he cannot buy. And she," he pointed at the girl with a cruel smile, "she was supposed to be erased. Nothing more than ash on the wind. Yet here she stands." The girl's fists tightened at her sides. For the first time, her anger outweighed her fear. "You murdered them," she said, her voice trembling but unyielding. "You murdered them all, and left me with nothing." The saloon's crowd shifted again, uneasy. Every man there had known whispers about Clayton Reeves. Some had profited by looking the other way. Others had tried to forget. But here was the living proof of his cruelty, standing barefoot and scarred in the very place he claimed as his kingdom. Clayton poured himself a whiskey, raising it high as though toasting his own sins. "I murdered nothing. I cleansed. I cleared. I made room for cattle, railroads, and men with vision. That's not murder, boy. That's destiny." Samuel's voice cut like steel. "Destiny doesn't scream in the night. It doesn't steal the name from a child's lips. It doesn't leave her walking barefoot in the dust." The silence that followed was heavier than gunpowder. Even the bartender, who had served Reeves for years, set his rag down and backed away, as though the room itself was preparing for blood. Then the girl said something no one expected. She looked at Clayton, her eyes glinting in the lantern light. "I remember my name," she whispered. Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out. "It's May Leon, and you will never take it from me again." The saloon seemed to exhale all at once. Samuel's hand finally rested on his revolver. Reeves sneered, but his jaw twitched, a crack in the armor of arrogance. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that this was no longer a forgotten girl, but a witness, a name, a soul he had failed to destroy. "Names," Clayton muttered, downing his whiskey. "Names are for tombstones, and yours will be carved before dawn." The crowd scattered as though lightning had struck. Chairs scraped. Boots thundered toward the door. Only Samuel, May Leon, and Clayton remained steady in the storm of panic. The duel was not declared, but everyone knew it had begun. The sheriff would not interfere. The law had no place here. Only dust, bullets, and memory. And for the first time, in years, Samuel felt that the girl beside him was not simply someone to protect. She was a flame, and together they would burn the man who had tried to erase her. The fire had consumed the last of the outlaw hideout, leaving only curling smoke and the stench of charred timber behind. The night was no longer alive with gunfire, but with the groans of the dying, the crackle of fading flames, and the hollow whistle of the wind pushing through blackened ruins. The cowboy stood tall in the midst of that desolation, his silhouette painted in blood and soot, his breath ragged and shallow, his hat brim low over his weary eyes. Beside him, the girl, no longer faceless, no longer nameless, sat against the remains of a half-burned beam, her small body trembling from exhaustion and the fever of her wounds. They had survived. But survival carried no light, no celebration, only a deeper shadow. The men they had faced were gone, buried in fire and bleed. Yet in death they had left a trail of voices that would never stop echoing. And as the moonlight carved the landscape in silver and gray, the cowboy knew the story was not finished, because vengeance never truly ends. It only trades hands. The girl's eyes followed him with something between gratitude and fear. He crouched, in front of her, his knees sinking into the ash. And for the first time since finding her on that dust-worn trail weeks ago, he dared to ask, "Do you know who you are now?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She reached instead for the blackened earth, tracing lines with her fingers, forming characters from a language he couldn't read. Each stroke carried weight, like prayers carved into stone. When she finished, she looked at him, her gaze holding all the storms of the past and all the ghosts of what had been taken from her. He didn't need to understand the meaning of her writing. He saw it in her face. The girl had remembered. Names, faces, screams. A home burned before his eyes ever found her. The truth was back, and with it came the unbearable weight of loss. The cowboy removed his hat, running a hand through his sweat-stained hair, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Silence was their language, and it said everything, that pain had carved them both into strangers who no longer belonged anywhere. But the West did not forgive, and the land did not let go. At dawn, they buried the bodies in shallow graves, the ground too dry and hard for anything deeper. The girl stood barefoot on the earth, holding a torn piece of cloth between her fingers, a scrap of fabric from one of the men who had destroyed her life. She dropped it into the grave as though sealing a pact. The cowboy covered the bodies with dirt and stones, each shovelful sounding like thunder in the stillness of the morning. By the time the sun climbed, the girl was sitting on a ridge, staring east. She seemed smaller now, but not fragile, like a knife sharpened by fire. The cowboy walked up beside her, his boots crunching gravel, and together they looked out at the horizon. There was nothing waiting for them in that direction. No home, no promise, no future. Only the road. The girl turned her head, her lips finally moving. Her voice was hoarse, thin, almost broken. "Will it ever stop hurting?" The cowboy took a long breath, his chest rising and falling as though he carried the weight of all the graves behind them. He answered with the truth, not the comfort she wanted, but the one she deserved. "No. But you'll learn to carry it." And in that moment, he realized she wasn't just someone he had saved. She was someone who had saved him too. Saved him. From the silence of his own emptiness, from the years of drifting through saloons and ghost towns with no reason to live. Now, whether he wanted it or not, he had a reason. They walked away from the smoking ruins, step by step into a world that would never welcome them. Strangers, outcasts, bound not by blood but by scars. He was the gun that kept her safe. She was the memory that kept him human. Behind them, the graves sat still, the wind sweeping dust over the stones. The West had swallowed many stories, buried countless names, but this one would linger, because sometimes the land itself remembers, and as the road stretched endless ahead, the narrator's voice would fade like smoke over the plains. In the dark corners of the West, there were no heroes, no saints, only the broken, carrying the weight of ashes and the whispers of ghosts. And when the world forgot them, they kept walking anyway, because there was nothing else left to do. The cowboy adjusted his hat. The girl tightened her grip on his arm, and together they disappeared. Into the horizon, two shadows bound forever by the kind of pain that the West itself had written into its bones.